So I'm super excited to welcome you to the Writers Center's virtual Craft Chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. I'm thrilled to have Dorsía Smith Silva with us tonight to celebrate her collection In Inheritance of Drowning. Dorsía, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Emily, for having me here. Thank you to everyone at the Writer Center. It is an absolute joy to be here tonight. And thank you to everyone that is joining us tonight, especially my students from the UPR. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for the support, everybody. And I'm going to start with just some poems from the book. And again, this is In Inheritance of Drowning. And as Emily mentioned, the book centers Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, which was a devastating hurricane throughout the Caribbean, but especially here in Puerto Rico. So I'm going to read some hurricane poems. The book also looks at the racial, social, and political injustices happening in the United States. So I'm going to read some of those poems as well, just a little bit, and then we're going to move into the questions. Okay, so my first poem is called Hurricane. And it is modeled after Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird. So this is called Hurricane. Among the leafy hills, the only thing moving was the tentacle of the hurricane. We are of several oceans, like a season in which there are too many hurricanes. The hurricane pummeled the trees. It was an insidious part of the wind. Water and people are circle. Water and people and hurricanes are circle. We do not know which to pray for first, the unbruising of earth or the unbruising of homes, the hurricane slumping or just after. Ice cubes disappear in blackouts with unblemished fruits. The rubble of the hurricane scatters to and fro. The warning scrolled in the war, an unquestionable cause. Oh, frightened Boricuas, why do you coordinate maps? Do you not see how the hurricane rapidly strips the steel of the bridges beside you? I know fearless winds and down snap lights. But I know too that the hurricane is involved in what I know. When the hurricane spread neck-deep water, it marked the drowning of one of many stars. At the blow of a hurricane mounting its claws, all roofs in Puerto Rico leaped away. We measure our fear by the windows. Once we turned our backs, and that we presumed the face of a rain shower for a hurricane. The wind is fleeing. The hurricane must be dimming. It was spring all September. It was raining, and it was going to rain. The hurricane curls in our ragged throat. The next poem I will read is about a bee, and it really represents when we think about a hurricane, it just doesn't affect humans or animals, it also affects the insects. So this is a poem about how it affects the bees. The poem is called The Bee. After Hurricane Maria, you spin in a daze, punch drunk from the fetid fumes of the generator. But you have made a decision to eat, live. You leap onto a tan dark bra that is wildly flapping on the clothesline, eager to gather something sweet and bring it to the surface. And yet there is nothing there but a bare circle of cotton. You wonder how the hurricane galloped away with the flowers, triggering a vanishing act. Well, where is the magician's wand to bring back the canopy of blossoms? It must be in the wind of loss, along with the why and because. There is no way to tell you about the aftermath, slow cruelty. It is a tale that claws cell by cell, leaving wings to litter this earth. The next poem I will read is going to be about the migration crisis that we're having right now in the US, and is called Return. The river said, I'll protect you and give you shelter. So we migrants came. We traveled a long journey. The river carried us like familiar wind. Then we walked and dreamed of motionless water, dreamed of water that said, welcome, come, come, come. Then they arrived with hanging scowls, arrived on horses long reined with whips. They ran down our bodies, trampled our faces, maimed our voices, made us turn our backs to water, told us water will not protect you here. This water does not belong to you. Your tears belong to you. That water is yours. That water should be plenty. Our tears scramble across miles. They get caught in many rivers, and our bodies keep drowning. We die in so many ways. They say we have no papers, no roots to dayfall here as we are being sent back. We see the water below us on the plain. It tells us to return. Think of tendrils pushing through the muddy bottom. We can't look away. And the last poem I will read is another political poem. This one is for all the missing BIPOC women and girls that do not get the national attention that they need, they deserve. It's really shameful that that is the case that is happening right now. So this poem is called Ghost Talker Poem. And for the Black girls that go missing from newspaper headlines and spotlight 5 p.m. news, what happened to them? Kick the can over, see if the bones glint in the slips of sunshine. Press your ears against the grass. Listen to what bleeds. My mother in her lovely tongue. Those girls are probably with friends, hanging out in the basement, wearing cigarette pants. Cigarette pants were fashionable once. They will turn up like loose change sidelined under sofa cushions, overdue books sandwiched in sweaters, favorite hairpins gagged by vents. Don't fret. Fret is a funny word for a young child. Sounds like forget. Don't forget, I won't, about the missing Black girls, probably already dead in a ditch or a field somewhere. I'm not supposed to think about death, passing away, kick the bucket 6 feet under, meeting our maker, which is what my teacher said. The class guinea pig has stopped moving. Mrs. Hayes poked its feet and then shoved it into a shoebox, said that we could bury it across from the tire swing. In back of the schoolyard, the dirt was ordinary, brown, hard. Eat your snacks, said my mother. Twinkies from 7-Eleven, maybe Wawa. Nothing from Superfresh or Pathmark, white filling, creamy like white fungus, oozing like zit pus, besmirching golden cake. The news says nothing about Black girls that go missing, not even a speck in someone's unread newspaper. Silence is when we inherit ghosts. I see them taking victory laps every night. Thank you so much. Thank you.
A minute to sit with those poems, and I just love being able to hear the musicality of the language and the sort of visceralness of the imagery, especially in that last poem, which is one that has kind of been with me since spending time with your collection as well. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Emily.
We'll have hopefully a lot of great questions and things to talk about in terms of those poems that you read too, which is great. But just to start, could you briefly tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Let's see. I am a professor at the University of Puerto Rico. Hello to all my students. Saludos. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate it. In addition to being a professor at the UPR, I'm also a poetry editor of The Hopper. So if anyone has environmental poetry, also we take artwork and prose as well. We welcome your work. We would love it. Please submit. We're always looking for excellent work. It will be an honor, a true honor really, to read your work and to publish it. Other things too, for me, I'm a member of the cohort of the 5 over 50 poets and writers get the word out as well. My work has been widely published as well. I have poems in Poets.org as well as the Los Angeles Review. I have also in Poetry Northwest, as well as, let's see, what's forthcoming. What's forthcoming, I think, is an anthology on the environment that's coming. So I'm really happy that my work has found so many different homes and so many wonderful homes as well. I also do a lot of work on mothering and migration. So if you Google me, you'll also see that I have poems in Mom Egg Review, which is another wonderful, journal as well. And I also have different editing books as well for it on mothering. So I have Latina Chicana Mothering, I have Caribbean Mothering, and all of those are pretty much through Demeter Press, which focuses on mothering and motherhood. So I think that's, a nice summation of who I am.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to think about how all of those different interests sort of find their way in your work as well. All right, here's our first question. Since this is a craft chat, to get us thinking about that word craft and that sort of act of craft, when you are writing, where does maybe thinking about craft come into play? Or when are you most aware of that part of the writing process?
I'm a big believer in the craft coming in after I have a draft, and it's very, very intuitive. I know some people do it the other way, but for me, I believe just get everything out on the page first. I don't believe in editing myself or censoring myself as a poet, as a writer. I think, okay, all of these ideas are wonderful. They're all valid. Just get it on paper or on your phone or somewhere where you can, have access to it. And then once I have that workable draft, that is when I will go back. And I have a lot of, pep talk conversations with myself. And it's like, okay, Dorsía, move this line, or maybe you should take this out, or maybe it can go into a formal form of a poem. But that's not something I'm thinking about when I'm writing the poem. Very rarely am I thinking this is going to be a sonnet, or this is going to be, sometimes I like to look at the modern forms like Jericho Brown, the duplex. Then I'll say like, oh, I'm going to have this as a duplex. That, is very rare for me to do that. I just write the poem first, and then I'll go back. And it happens actually, pretty quickly when I'm looking at the poem, and then it just comes as an intuitive sense. Some people call it like the sixth sense, or for me, it's just the intuitive sense. And I'll go in and I'll say, okay, this poem looks like this, or this is what this poem should be for this poem. And as the writer, I always try to respect the poem itself, because what I have found is sometimes if you get so fixated on trying to fit that poem into a certain form, it's not going to work. There's going to be like a lot of resistance there, and the poem either feels very stilted or forced. Something's not working in that poem. So then I'll take a step back and I'll say, let me let the poem, breathe a little bit. What is the poem trying to tell me? And then it'll come to me and I'll say, oh, this is it. And sometimes it may be a while. It could be like a week or 2 weeks. I think the longest poem in the collection was actually over a year, and that was Mad for Philly. And that was because the poem, there was so much I wanted to say in that poem, and I wasn't sure, how to say it. And so I was experimenting with line breaks and experimenting with, should I, have an erasure poem? Should I, have a modern sonnet? I wasn't sure what form I wanted it to take place. And then it just came to me. And then I said, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And I think as a poet, it's so nice to use punctuation, the backslash or the asterisk. I mean, there's so many ways that you can then say, this is going to be a new form of the poem or a new segment of the poem. You can play with all of that. And that finally came to me. Once I let go of trying to make the poem fit into a certain form, that's when the poem was able to really speak to me. And I encourage readers to not, readers and also, writers, not to be afraid of, just working with the page. Don't be afraid to experiment. Not everything that you write is going to be published, and that's okay. And you don't have to be dismayed that the form or that final shape doesn't come to you right away. It may come in a week or next week, or it could take, hopefully not as long as it did for me with Mad About Philly. But it can take sometimes, a year. And I think that's okay, because the poem still is trying to work through its final form, and that's okay. And I think to do justice to the poem, you have to be fair to, not only the poem itself, but also to what you're trying to convey to readers as well.
I love that, thinking of the sort of ability to almost let go of your kind of preconceived idea of what the poem should be, right? And the ways that we can kind of get in the way of our own writing by being like, well, I need this poem to do these things, or I need it to be this form. And then we get so frustrated with it that we don't know what to do with it anymore. And I love that you mentioned the word play as well, that sort of element of play that can come in, especially in revision, which makes it so fruitful and expansive and fun.
Yeah, I think sometimes I remember I went to this one workshop and the writer was so fixated on having a certain last line be that last line of the poem. And that's fine. As the writer, you can do that. But I think sometimes you miss all the possibilities of what the poem could actually be like. It's like, well, what would happen? And it doesn't mean that maybe that is going to be the last line of the poem, but what would happen if that last line became the first line? Or you truncated that last line, or you took that last line and made it an erasure, or you took that last line and you said, wait a minute, I'm gonna, have, part of the last line then move into part 2 of the poem. I mean, there's so many possibilities. I think sometimes if you become so fixated on what the poem is going to end, how the poem's going to end and what the poem has to be like when it gets to the end, then you really miss all the possibilities, all the beautiful possibilities. So I think if we just let ourselves play, no harm in that, and you feel unrestrained, unrestricted, and then see where the poem can go. And those really have been my best poems. When I just go in and say, I'm just going to see what happens, then I'm amazed, at like, oh my goodness, look how wonderful this poem is. And that was really the poem that I read, Ghost Talker poem. I was just thinking like, I had read this article and I thought, how come, BIPOC women are not getting, recognition, national coverage when they go missing. I'm like, this is really, horrific. I'm going to write a poem about it, but I wasn't sure what form it was going to take. I just started, writing, and then all of a sudden, the mother figure comes in. So I think if you, open yourself up to the realm of all possibilities of the poem, just putting it on paper, and then you go back and then you can say, okay, now I can edit. Now I can see, what's working in this poem and where perhaps it feels a little stale. Maybe I need, to add something else here. But sometimes when you do that, the poem it's already pretty much there. It needs very little editing after that.
For sharing all that. And it's always great to hear all these possibilities about revision too, right? The ways that we can do those what ifs, and we can always go back to the way it was if we want to, but we're sort of unlocking our own practice and our own potential in these different possibilities too. All right, I think we'll move to kind of continue to talk a little bit about form, because you were sort of mentioning how that comes later on in the process for you. And you mentioned the sonnet. You also mentioned the duplex with it, which is a kind of sonnet variation from Jericho Brown, which I love. So I'd love to hear what attracts you to the sonnet in terms of maybe its possibilities. I always love to think about how Rita Dove calls it a little world, because they're so tight, so compact, but they can hold so much. And I love the sonnet. It's one of my favorite forms. So I was really happy, counting my lines here and seeing those forms in the collection. So what's your relationship to that form in particular?
I also love the sonnet because sometimes when you are writing, you feel overwhelmed. And when you think of the sonnet, 14 lines, that's all it has to be, 14 lines. And thanks to so many wonderful modern writers, thank you, Diane Seuss, we have so many modern forms of sonnets. So now you can move away from what we used to think. I mean, when I was in high school, it has to be the Petrarchan / Opinion sonnet. It has to be the Shakespearean or Elizabethan sonnet. Now we have moved away from that. So we have all these kind of modern sonnets. So you have 14 lines, but they don't necessarily have to rhyme. It doesn't necessarily have to be one stanza. And you can play so much within those 14 lines. It's amazing. So when sometimes people will say, I want to do a poem and I want to do it in a form, but the villanelle is so overwhelming and the pantoum, and I feel overwhelmed. What about the sonnet? It's only 14 lines. And now, because we have all these modern sonnets, you can repeat a sentence. There's no reason why you can't say, well, I'm going to have line 2 be the same as line 8 or line 14. There's so much room for that. And I tell people, just like Diane Seuss has reinvented the sonnet, just like we have Jericho Brown with the duplex, why can't you create your own form, your own modern form of a sonnet, or your own modern form of whatever kind of poetic form that you want? And that's really, I think, one of the beauties of being a poet is that there are just so many amazing forms that are coming out. I mean, I'm always amazed when I'm reading. I mean, I was just reading something and they were saying that now we have, there's like I always know about the tanka, but there's like the flaming haibon, and people are now doing like the flaming sonnet where you have like a sonnet and then it goes down into a tanka. I'm just like amazed, or you can, boil it down to a haiku. I'm amazed, really at all of the possibilities that we can do with the form. So I tell people when they say, oh my goodness, I can never do a poem that has a specific form, the sonnet, because you can really push it. And even if you think, well, it's not an exact sonnet, there are poets with the title, almost a sonnet or quasi sonnet, you know, and so you keep going with that. You can play on that. And I think, again, pushing the boundaries to break these traditional forms, who knows what the new form is going to be about. I mean, I remember when I was reading The Tradition by Jericho Brown and he was talking about the duplex, I was like, oh my goodness, a new poetic form. I was so excited. And also reading Diane Seuss, as I mentioned, with, her modern forms of sonnet. So we have so many writers now that are unafraid to say, we have these traditional forms, yes, but we're going to then see how we can revise those forms, break them so that they become something more modern and something very approachable. So for me, I took that with the 14 lines and I said, what can I do with this? And I'm always curious about, where we're going with the form, where we're going with poetry, and trying to see, okay, how can I experiment? What can I add to this, wonderful long list of looking at modern day forms? So I'm hoping to add to that. I hope that my collection does add to that. And I think when we look at those 14 lines, as you mentioned, they do contain a full world. Everything that you need is there. So when people say, oh, I have to have poems 2-3 pages, you can, but you don't have to. And the other thing that you can do with the sonnet, you can have multiple sonnets as a poem. So it could be sonnet 1, that's number 1, or number 2, or you can have a little backslash to separate the different sonnets. I mean, there's so many ways that you can play with that. And again, all of that is poetry.
And I love to, I think we're all leaving here with a great reading list of poets. If we haven't read The Tradition by Jericho Brown, which is a great one. I love Diane Seuss's Frank sonnets, even the one that sort of unfolds. I always show it to my students and they're like, what do you mean? The lines are longer than the page. So, you know, all these possibilities, right? Even the page itself can be its own form. So what happens if we sort of break the page, right? All these different things. Yeah, no, that's wonderful. You mentioned a little bit about erasure and some of these forms that engage in self-erasure, and we do see one in the book. Could you talk about how you thought to use self-erasure for that poem and maybe what that kind of level of repetition, but also transformation can give you as a poet?
Yes, I'm a big fan of erasure poets. And if you, adding to the reading list, if you haven't read Imner Beasy Phillips' Song, I recommend that book. That book, when I read it as a student, I was a graduate student when I read that book, I was blown away because I had really never seen anything like that before. For those, just a little bit of background, the Zong was a boat and the slaves were thrown overboard because the owners figured that they could get the money for the slaves. Nurbisi Philip goes more into detail, but the book, it's like the ancestral voices of those that were thrown overboard. And what she does in that book, several poems have erasure, then you see, you know, the different kind of, the way that she positions the syllables, mimicking how the slaves were, you know, drowning and the loss of their voices. You'll see the different, you know, lettering that she'll use. Some are in italics, you know, the fonts, and even the shading. So, I mean, it's just, the creativity is at such a high level of that book. And so I thought, okay, how can I, you know, honor just a little bit Emner Beasy Phil, just do like 1/8 of what she's doing in that book. And I also love Nicole Seeley. And if you haven't read the Ferguson Report, I also recommend that you read that. And I thought, okay, what can I do? I am not an artist by any means. So I love when I see erasure poets and they have, you know, all this visual work and they'll have, you know, letters on top of each other and shapes. I cannot do that, you know, and even people that will have cutout letters and they'll like superimpose them and I also cannot do that. So I'm working with like my own limitations and also learning different things on the computer that I can do. But I wanted to show again the possibilities of language and using the page, using that white space for telling a message, what is said on the page, and then what is not said. So that's what I was trying to show, because in that particular poem in the book, again, you have immigrants that are coming, trying to have a better life, but their voices are not being heard in that poem. So I was really trying to show that too, and also layering that with this symbolism of drowning. Because what happens when you're drowning? Well, it's hard to, you know, it's hard to talk, it's hard to have your breath, it's hard for people to hear you, listen to you. And also what's happening right now in some pockets of the US, especially for marginalized communities, their voices are not being heard. So I also wanted to show that in the poem as well. So it starts off where you have, you know, the full voices of everybody, but then as it goes through the poem, less and less and less and less, and then the symbolism overwhelming with the drowning. And that ties in, of course, with the book, An Inheritance of Drowning, because, you know, what kind of world are we, you know, inheriting here? Unfortunately, you know, we're inheriting a world now where so many marginalized communities are afraid to, you know, to speak up, you know, are being told, you know, we don't really want to hear your voices. We don't honor your voices when you do speak up. And on top of that, with the drowning, so many environmental issues, you know, which are drowning all of us, you know, literally as as well because of the climate crisis that we're having. So I was trying to show all of that in the erasure. I hope I did a good job. Because again, with erasure poetry, there's just so much that you can do. You know, with visual imagery, crossing out, cutting up, covering up. I mean, I really would love at some point to take like a studio design class so that I could learn how to have, you see these, wonderful poets and they have all these artistic images, on top of the erasure. It's just, it for me is breathtaking. And I'm, amazed when I see that. Like, how did you do that? It's just wonderful, really.
No, thank you. And I think too, something that you were talking about really connects to this idea of form and the content of the poem, right? How the form can also become part of the fabric of the poem. And you mentioned drowning, which we get in so many different ways throughout the collection, of course, in the title, but these different meanings and layers to physical drowning, drowning out of voices, right? All of this kind of considerations coming together in the kind of physical act of erasure on the page as well, really sort of mirroring that sense too, which is really beautiful. I'm gonna pop into the chat because I know we have a lot of questions coming in, which is wonderful. So thank you all here. There's a couple questions that are sort of around similar themes, so I might try to combine some together because we've been talking about your poetry, especially in this collection, and how it is really touching upon sort of very present topics, right? The climate crisis, the ongoing climate crisis, Hurricane Maria itself, right? Marginalized communities, the migrant crisis, all of these different elements here. So there's a couple questions about your approach to these topics within your poetry. So I wonder if you could just speak sort of generally about how you approach these topics within your work and how you maybe see your voice bringing forth these topics, which I think a lot of us get maybe that impulse to write about what's happening right now, right? But sometimes we're either not prepared to write about it in the right way, or we're not ready to write about it for certain reasons. So I just wondered if you could speak generally, and then maybe we'll dive into some of the more specific questions that are coming through too.
Sure. I'm just going to talk a little bit about how the book came about, and I think that'll answer a part of that question. Then I'll talk, about writing about contemporary events. When Hurricane Maria happened, I was writing in a journal about what was happening on a day-to-day basis. And it wasn't until about like a year later when I went back to that journal and I realized what I had written in the journal happened to be in the form of poems. So I didn't know at the time when I was writing that I was going to be, writing a book. I wasn't in that frame of mind at all. I was just thinking, how do I process what's happening? Because in Puerto Rico, many of us were without water, were without power. There were, we had trees everywhere. The blackout was very long. I think in Puerto Rico, some places it was almost a year before some places had electricity. Even now, 7 years later, still haven't fully recovered. So I was writing about everything from standing in line at the supermarket to driving without traffic lights, if anybody's ever had that experience. And at first you're like, oh my goodness, there are no lights. How do I cross? And then later you're like, okay, I can do this. I can do this. So I wanted to, highlight all of those emotions. But I was just writing at the time. When I went back a year later, I was able to have some emotional distance. I think if I had tried to publish everything at that time, it would have been probably too emotional, probably too sentimental, and probably too overwritten. And so a year later, going back, I said, oh my goodness, I have poems. Let me now see how I can actually form them into something publishable, because it's different from what you think is wonderful. You're like, oh, these are beautiful poems, and that they could have just stayed in my journal. But I thought, I think I have a book here. I think I really have something special here. And people need to know the story of Hurricane Maria and Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico just, we're not just, Bacardi and hanging on the beach and having fun time. Hurricane Maria was very devastating. And so many people were not aware of that devastation. So I thought people need to be aware of this. And also people were not aware of other measures, the relationship Puerto Rico has with the United States. Some people think, well, you're a territory. But in reality, a lot of what is happening shows this colonial relationship, and people aren't aware of that either. So I wanted that also to be in the book. And when we were thinking of the racial, social, political injustices that were happening, as I was revising the book, we had, Black Lives Matter, there was the pandemic. So with those matters, thinking about how we can write about contemporary events and putting them in a publishable form, again, my advice, put it on paper first. And if you feel you're too close to that material, if you feel like, oh my goodness, my heart is 100% in this, I have no, emotional distance from that, take a break and come back to it, where you can really look at it with a new critical lens, because that's important as a writer, that you think, oh my goodness, if this is going to be published, let me have it in a shape that's worthy of having my name attached to it. So come back to it, then look through it. Okay. And I put my little editor's hat on and I think, okay, do I have words where it, maybe I need to polish this? Or, does it look like, maybe there's too much figurative language? How's the ending? Does the ending leave me more with a or more with a breathless quality? Like, oh my goodness, I want more. When I have that ending, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I wrote that, I want more, that's when I know that's the ending, this is the poem. So going back, looking at the poem with a critical lens, should I move this line? How are my endings? Maybe this word shouldn't be here. What if I took this word out? What if I changed this form from a noun to an adjective? I think when we go back, it's critical that we ask ourselves, like I have like a mental list in my head of questions that I automatically ask. And it's not something that I do out loud. It's just very intuitive. And I go through it really quick. It's like a mental checklist. So I just go through it. And then I say, okay, no, this isn't working. No, this has to be moved. This has to move. No, this has to go here. And then if a poem needs more revision, that's fine too, because then I'll say, oh, and I'll make a note to myself. And I have like so many notes. Sometimes I'll do it on my phone because sometimes it's easier to do it on the phone than on paper. So I'll have it in my phone. I'll say, okay, add a stanza to this. Oh, and then sometimes during the day, a line will come to me and I'll say, oh, this is the line. And I'll make a note on my phone, add this line. So I have random notes in my phone about adding lines or words, or sometimes even like a sound. I'm like, oh, that sound. I want that sound. Or I'll have an image and I'll say, oh, the poem needs this image, something about green. I like a lot of color sometimes in my poem, especially the word green and the image green. So I'll say, oh, I have to have this in this poem. This is where the poem, it has to go, and I'll make a note, to that. So I think when you are writing about contemporary issues, it's very important. People want to read those. It's very important to document what's happening. People want to read about this. People want to know other viewpoints. And as writers, share those stories. Don't be afraid to share those stories. But I do think it's important to come back and really try to look at that poem with a sort of critical lens. And again, if you feel that you're too close to that poem, if it's just too much, weighing on your heart, come back to it. And then you can really then say, okay, this is where I need the poem to go. But again, there is a difference between writing for yourself and publishing. So if you're happy with having that poem just, for yourself and friends, or you want to self-publish the poem, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're thinking, I really want the poem to be in, fill in the blank, this journal, and especially the competitive journals, then it's important that you go and look at the poem again with a critical lens. Come back to it when you can have a little bit more objectivity and can go through the poem with like a little checklist and then send it off.
Thank you. No, thank you for sort of answering that large question. But I think it really comes down to, right, that element of time too, how much time we have between that initial writing and when we are able to come back to it, which sometimes is a long time, sometimes it's not that long that we're able to kind of bridge that gap. But it also enables us to do the work with care, right? Care on the page, but also care for ourselves too, which I think is also important, especially as I think so many of us are wanting to write about our current moment, moments beyond the current moment, moments in the past, and sort of give voice to what might not be on pages already too.
I completely agree with you. I mean, especially with everything happening right now, you may not just have the bandwidth right now to deal with this. And I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, in my case, Hurricane Maria happened in 2017. So in many ways, because the process of writing the book, getting it accepted, and actually having it come out in the world has taken so long, I can actually, talk about these experiences and look at the book in a different way versus if the book had been, published in 2018 or even 2019. I don't think I would be able to really, talk about the poems in this way without really feeling, so overwhelmed and just so, distraught. But definitely, I think, taking care of yourself and making sure that you have the bandwidth to do everything. I think it's very challenging right now with everything happening.
Yeah, we're getting input and news from left, right, everywhere. And sometimes poetry is the best outlet for those feelings, but sometimes it does take that time in a lot of different ways too. So hopefully that covers a good bulk of some of those questions. I know that we had some kind of intersecting ideas from folks, which is great. Maybe to pivot a little bit to a question that was sort of earlier in the chat about how we were talking about play on the page earlier. So the question is if you would talk a little bit about that element of joy in creating or in writing or writing poetry.
I think it's important, especially as writers, for us to remember why we are writing, because so many people get worried about the output and about, oh, I have to get it accepted. And if it doesn't get accepted, I'm going to feel, so, worried about, when am I ever going to get something accepted? And then they feel this sense of rejection and then they feel despondent. As writers, remember, it's a joy, to be writing. It's a joy to have the craft. It's a joy to see your work on the page. Think about that. Think about what you're creating. Think about that love that you're putting into the poem, the love that you give yourself, the love that you give that poem. You are so worthy. So I always tell people, remember that, because it is really easy to get caught up in the cycle of, oh, another rejection and another rejection and another rejection and rejection. Remember, writing is so different than publishing. And if you really want that work to be published, there are other outlets. You can start your own journal. You can put it on your blog. You can have your own e-zine. You can ask a friend, hey, friend, would you mind posting my poem on your webpage, or having me over for a chat and I just read to some friends, have a discussion. There's so many ways to get your work out there. So remember that joy. And there's so many writers that talk about that too. I mean, Ellen Bass is one that I constantly go back to because she's very honest about writing. And she's like, oh, when I don't write, I get cranky. And I'm like, exactly. I feel the same way because writing, you feel like, this is what I'm going to do today. Ooh, and it makes you happy, and if you're feeling where it's a chore, like I went to one workshop and the person said, you should always write. It's like exercise. You should do it every day. And I thought, but what if you're just tired? If you're just mentally exhausted, and your body and your mind are saying no, then what's the point, you know? And the person said, oh, there's no such thing as a bad workout. You have to be in the moment. You have to think of it as a writer and a practice. Something's going to come out of it. And I thought, that's just not the best advice. So I realized, you know, going to different workshops, what works for one person is not going to work for everybody. It's not one size fits all when it comes to the writing practice. So my approach is, you know, you approach writing with joy. If you feel tired, take a break. And it doesn't mean that you're not contributing to the craft. And that's another thing too, that I think that's really important, because some people feel as if you always have to write. You can be reading and contributing to the craft. You can be going to a craft talk and contributing to the craft. You can be talking to a friend, poem right there, listening to music, going for a walk outside. You never know where inspiration is going to come from. When people get stuck, I tell them, what do you like to do? Cook, bake, walk, yoga. What do you like to do? Do that. The poem is waiting for you, but do that first. The poem is going to come, because sometimes people feel pressure. I haven't written something in a week or a month. It's okay, because you may not realize it, but you've been exposed to all these ideas, conversations, recipes even. Sometimes family members will say something to you and you're like, oh, that's right, that's a memory of grandma doing this, or when I had that toy as a child. There's a poem. So you never know where inspiration is going to come from. So hold on to all of that. I am a big believer in count it all as joy, really. You know, it's such a gift, I feel, to be able to do what we love, which is write. And the rejections are going to come. That's just part of being a writer. But so will a yes. Hold on to the yes. If you have to tack it on your wall or look at it every day on your phone, look, I got an acceptance. You know, but really, that's not a yardstick to measure yourself. I know sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in that, but you're writing because you really have something to say and it's worthy of being said. So hold on to that, you know, and just tell yourself, you know, if you have like a mantra, I am worthy, you know, I'm putting it on paper, this is a joy, count it all joy, and then just write. So for some people, they need to, you know, have that pep talk, you know, that self-love. Some people have like the vision board, you know, and then they have little, you know, mantras on the vision board. I'm constantly in conversation with myself, reminding myself, you know, you're worthy. Put it on paper, get it out in the world, and eventually something will get accepted. You know, just keep sending it out. The odds are in your favor if you keep sending things out. Just keep sending your work out. Something will get accepted.
I think I love these chats because I always hear something that I need to hear in the moment, and I hope that that's also true for our guests as well. And I think just thinking about the ways that we can get so caught up in that cycle, right, and sort of lose sight of what's actually bringing us to the page in the first place, which is that joy, that excitement of creating something, that surprise of finding yourself on the page in some way. And so thank you for that answer, and for also pointing out so many of these different avenues of sort of creation. You mentioned a lot of different ways that our community can be so impactful to us, even if we're not writing on the page. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your writing community, or how you see community come into your own writing practice.
I am so thankful to have people in my life that support my work. You know, it means so much, whether they're coming to this chat or they're asking me, you know, when are you giving another reading, or how's it going? I'm so happy that they check in with me. I am not the kind of writer, though, that's in a writing group. And full confession, I always thought I was weird. I was like, what's wrong with me? How come I can't be in a writing group? What's wrong with me? And then Carl Phillips, he said, very honestly, very candid conversation, he said, I can't be in a writing group. In fact, I was kicked out of one. He said, it doesn't work for me. I'm just not good at it. And I thought, well, if it were, you know, if Carl Phillips said this, that, and I'm not the only one. because everyone kept saying, you have to be in a writing group. You have to have people read your work. And for me, it doesn't work because I get so caught up in what everybody else is saying. I get like, well, what did you say? I get so caught up in what everyone else is saying that I really lose my own vision of what I'm trying to do. And I have like all this feedback and it gets so overwhelming. So for me, it doesn't work. But for other people, writing groups work. Carr Phillips, he said that he has one person that he gives his work to, and that person gives him feedback. So I think that if that works for you, if that is a strategy that you want to take, great. Otherwise, I mean, there are so many ways you can have community. Thanks to social media, Instagram. I mean, I'm not really on social media a lot, but because of the book, I was told, hey, there's a community waiting. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try Instagram. And it's amazing because so many people will send little messages like, hey, saw you in the craft talk, great job, or hey, good for you for doing this. And it's just so nice to have people give you like a compliment or to check in with you and to say, great job, and just to keep encouraging you. So it's very nice to have that. So community works in different ways. And it can also be right there in your family too, if you have that too. So I would say find the community that works best for you. It's not going to be a one size fits all. If a writing group is great for you, then join a writing group, or maybe have like that one or two, friends that you can, ask for, feedback, advice. Otherwise, we're out here, and for anyone, I'm on Instagram, so don't be shy to send me a message. I always send people, when I see things that they're doing, I send them little messages like, congratulations, great job, I saw this. And I think as writers, it's just really lovely that we support each other. It's not competitive at all, because I'm a big believer, there's so much room at the table. I welcome everybody. If you are doing a great job, I'm there to cheer you on 110%. I want everyone to succeed. So I love when people, are doing well, and I see it on, Instagram. I'm like, oh, good for you. Great. So if you don't have one, find your community. We're waiting for you.
That's so important to that idea that it isn't a scarcity model, right? We can get also wrapped up in that kind of capitalist notion, right? You have to be productive, you have to put your work out, but also there's not enough space for everyone, right? Only certain people can get published, or only certain publications want certain voices. And there are so many amazing journals, so many different avenues for getting your work out, even beyond publishing, that when I see folks and students of mine, get caught up in that spiral, it's like, wait, we're not in competition. We need to be bringing each other up, not sort of icing each other out. And I think that's so important. And hopefully you'll get a lot of Instagram followers. I see some people in the chat wanting your Instagram handle.
Oh, here, I'll put it in the chat. Come join me.
See,
Yeah, here, I'm putting it in the chat right now. Okay, I'm D. Smith Silva. So yeah, I'll follow you back. I love following people and encouraging you. Whatever you're doing, love it. Send you a little, boost of inspiration and encouragement. It means so much really as writers, because sometimes we just really need, that extra boost of support just to keep going, and to say, you're doing a great job.
All right, I'm just taking a glance at our time, so maybe we'll hit our final question, which is, what is your go-to craft advice? Maybe for students or for yourself. What would you like to kind of leave us with this evening?
I would like to leave you with, I saw someone mention it in the chat about rest is productive. And again, your writing practice is your own. Many people will have different tidbits of advice, and they'll say, oh, you have to write every day, you have to do this. that does not work with me because, as my students know, I teach Tuesday and Thursdays. So the days that I teach doesn't happen. Wednesdays, I'm on the university. So at least Monday, Friday, I'm also a very active mom. So we have lives, and it doesn't always fit in with writing. So if you're writing in the car, maybe you're in the metro, that's fine. Or if you just need a break, that's also fine too. So I think rest, being productive, and remembering that there's so much room for inspiration, even if you think, well, I should be doing something. It's okay to take a break. If you want to read the newspaper, because reading the newspaper, that could be, you know, a whole book there. You can say, oh my goodness, I should be writing about this, or a poem, or somebody will say a line in a movie. There was one poet that was saying how she just watched movies for a month because she was just, I have nothing else to give. I'm just going to watch movies for a month. But at the end, it was like, wait a minute, that movie had this line, and I'm going to write about this. So again, you never know where inspiration is going to come from. And if you're looking, I'll end with this too. If you're looking for a really good prompt, since the book is called An Inheritance of Drowning, you can think about your own inheritance poem. What have you inherited? And it could be something tangible, or it could be something intangible. But think about, what are you going to inherit? And, the book is dedicated to my son, Antonio, and I put he inherited love, but I also hope, for the generation that's coming up, we leave a world that is better, especially when it deals with climate change and how we treat others and how we treat our relationship with the environment. I'm really hoping for a social transformation that's coming about. I'm waiting for that. And I tell everybody, the time is now for that. But I'm really hopeful for that. So a prompt for everybody, maybe this evening, or if you're tired, tomorrow or whenever, it's there for you to come back to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I love
Thank you.
leaving
Thank you.
on hope and leaving with a prompt. And if folks are wanting to come back to this, we will have the recording available soon. So you can always come back to all of this lovely kind of tidbits and craft nuggets that we have here. So thank you so much, Dorsía, for sharing your work, being so generous with your process and your answers here. Another reminder, it's in the chat. Please, please, please buy a copy of the book. We heard a few poems from it, but there are so many more in here. Lots of wonderful repetitions, lots of wonderful new ways of looking at form, looking at voices on the page. So please pick up a copy. Dorsía, thank you so much for being here. And thank you to our lovely audience for all of your questions. I know I didn't get to all of them, but hopefully you're all leaving here today with something that you can carry with you beyond. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great evening, everyone. All right. Thanks, Dorsía.
Oh, thank you. I loved it. I know we still have some people, hanging out, but this was so much fun. The hour went by so quickly. Thank you so
It
much.
always does. Every time I glance at the clock and I see us approaching, I get so sad because I feel like some of these chats we could just go on for hours. So thank you for sharing so much and for taking some of those questions on the fly too. It was really wonderful and exactly what I needed this evening. So
Oh, thank you. It was lovely, really a joy. Thanks so much.
thank you. Please be in touch as book things are happening. And if you're looking to submit your work, please think about Poet Lore as well. We'd love to see you in our queue. And for
Oh,
folks
thank you.
lingering on.